Failure is definitely one of those things that we learn relatively early on in life that is not only mandatory for human life, but it's essential for human life as such. When we first start out, failure, it triggers a state of oblivion. Um, when we're young, when we're little, when we don't get something we want, or, the environment brings us something that's less than satisfactory, we just cry. We just start bawling. And it is that state of oblivion that is just seemingly automatically triggered in response. And that feeling of oblivion is also accompanied by the inability to see the variables surrounding what's happening. And over time, as we age, we slowly start to become aware of the variables that surround the things that are happening. And we slowly learn what this whole scheme is that is human life. And ideally, as we age, we lose that ability to just collapse into oblivion when we don't get what we want. It actually happens pretty early. And, if you were to meet somebody in their 20s or 30s who just started crying when they didn't get their way, we would either think that we would wonder if this is real. We would say, is this some sort of manipulation to maybe sway the decision, or change what's happening? Or does this person actually unable to conceive the variables that went into this and they just collapse into oblivion? And usually we grow out of that pretty early. Maybe we'll have a little bit of a tantrum. Maybe we'll react still very emotionally, but we'll still understand why. And most of us, by the time we get a little bit older, we can see the main variable. We can see the main reason why. But there also is a second and a third and a fourth. And there's far more than that. And the clever person sees not only the first, second, third, and fourth, but even the more peripheral, smaller variables that exist, but they're more subtle. And the more variables you can comprehend in any given event, the more likely you are to fine-tune yourself into more favorable future outcomes. And it really is, sort of a matter of intelligence and experience, those two things kind of together. And failure and success end up coming together as this two parts of a large interconnected series of ratios, as with most things, but very specifically this. It's like, when do you officially deem, like a whole life a failure? Like when can you say, well, that life was a failure? It would either be because of something massive, just huge, or somewhere within that ratio, a huge number of losses as opposed to wins. When do you consider a football team season a failure? Sometimes it's not so easy. Sometimes we kind of say, well, they're pretty good, maybe 10-6, something like that. There's a difference between that and, 3 and 12, obviously, which is a clear failure. But even within a failure, this is the weird thing, too. You have to have that sense of, at least I, XYZ. It's very helpful to have an at least that you can fall back on. I mean, there's even been times where I've said, at least I have both arms. At least I have one arm. Which sounds kind of stupid, but it's true. It would suck to be going through whatever you're going through with no arms. Or even one arm. Or to be blind, or anything. The point is that it can always be a whole lot worse. And you kind of start to see that the whole failure success thing is a matter of scale, from what level you're observing from, how many things that you notice per situation, and do you have that ability to say, well, we'll see next time, and sort of project into the future a foreseeable change in outcome, because there are absolutely levels of failure. And the more interconnected tethers, whether it be financially or people involved, the size of the organization, or the stakes in what you're trying to accomplish, the levels expand further and further. And typically when there's a loss of human life involved, we consider that to be the highest level of failure if somebody dies. And in order for that to be true, we all have to agree that human life is valuable, which is a given in most of the Western world and most of the world in general, but that's the largest level. If somebody dies, it's a failure, which is kind of an easy jumping off point. And a lot of people have died. And we're at this point in civilization where we have tweaked a lot of things, made a lot of rules, done a whole lot of things because of that fact alone. And you kind of see how, failure is the other side of success in this coin. Yeah, so it's kind of a necessary thing for this universe to even be as it is. And total victory is realized among a complex series of ratios that have gone favorably, because you can lose battles and win the war as well, obviously. And you could consider stubbing your toe a failure in walking, or, blasting your elbow a failure in coordination, or biting your tongue a failure in chewing. Because we're supposed to be very experienced and skilled in those things after a certain point. And kind of what you see in that is that there is no absolutely 100% perfection. There is no perfect square or perfect circle, or there isn't even any straight lines. Because as the late great Alan Watts so eloquently said, existence is wiggly. And it is. And the only place that you'll find straight lines is where people are. There are none anywhere else. And when we look at other planets for signs of life through telescopes, we look for straight lines. Something abnormal, which is a sign of intelligence, is organization in terms of geometry. If you look at any city from up above, it's obvious that there's some sort of intelligent life there, because you'll see what amounts to straight lines at that level of magnification. But when you get closer, none of them are perfectly straight. And even the straightest lines that we've ever come up with have some small degree of variability. And within all of our efforts, it is wiggly. It's organic. It's more like a forest tree line. Beautiful, still there, obviously a system, very magnificent in its balances, but not a single straight line in sight. Nothing, it's still perfect, but not perfect in the context of geometry. And it's sort of that balance between the perception of brilliantly perfect symmetry and geometry and asymmetry and wiggliness. So a failure, there's a difference between getting completely blown out in a game and losing by a point due to a game-winning shot. There's a different sort of analysis that goes into how you review that game, because it's a ratio. The points scored are an actual ratio of all of the preparation that's gone into everything before that game, plus the very sheer will, which counts for more than maybe we like to admit sometimes, but sheer will to win. And you have to actually fucking inspire that in people, like the will to keep going. And if you have to say out loud, there's a difference too between actually failing and losing clearly and objectively and saying out loud, I am a failure. If you get to that point, it's either because you don't quite have the resilience yet, or you have genuinely lost quite a bit. And it's time for a serious reconsideration of your overall approach. And it's really weird how it is actually different to say it out loud. It's strange how that is, but it's true. And yeah. And there's this it's almost like a wormhole in any particular domain. It's almost like a voyage or a dramatic trip in any given domain. It has this element of buying in, and you get sucked into it, and everything is so important there, and that is the very crux of the dramatic element. Like with basketball or football or soccer or anything, we ultimately have to reach this point where we pull back and say it's just a game. But in the moment, it's very different. There's a difference between the in the moment sensation of victory and loss and that feeling of pulling back and being like, whoa, this is just a game, you guys. Relax. And it kind of goes back and forth between those two. It's like, how important can these things become? And it is the mark of a civilization or society that's gone pretty far on the scale of sophistication, where games are that serious. When games get serious, you're doing okay. And there's extremely high level failures too. There's the whole thing with being too big to fail. That's when other people have to basically prevent your failure, because it would mean that they themselves would fail. And it's another level of failure to shoot up rockets, and see what they do, basically blow up in the sky. And you have to basically get that as perfect as you can get it. You have to get every single little ratio tuned so finely that the apex of your efforts is firing up human beings, because that's the ultimate bar for success or failure in your particular domain, is whether or not human beings die at the apex of it. And war is even that way as well, increasingly more so, especially in the United States. Like, one death here in the U.S. military is kind of a big deal. You know what I mean? It wasn't always that way, but it's increasingly more that way. There is social failure, moral failure, intellectual failure, physical failure. There's failure to understand. There's the spreading of psychological failure. There is carrying failure, wearing it. And there's also shedding it. Some people shed failure like it's absolutely nothing at all. Some people can lose and lose and lose and still have this part of them that simply just doesn't believe that as a sort of final destination, or they never get to that point where they think to themselves out and have to say out loud, I'm a failure. Like, it doesn't even register. It's almost a delusion in a sense. And there are other people who don't get this one thing that seems so important because they are just sucked into the wormhole so far, and they've attached so many other elements of their life to it, that if this one thing fails, and it's almost like the too big to fail thing, but that big thing failing, and it's hard to shed. And it's like I said, people wear that and spread it and carry it, and it slowly starts to seep into other areas. And in a cruel twist of fate, it increases the likelihood of additional failure. It has a momentum, and it's tough the way intelligence is too, because you don't really know whether or not you're going to end up with it or not, but it's the most important thing, considering it's the number one in terms of human speciality. Intelligence is our thing. So if you have it, you have a secret advantage. And if you have it, you sometimes have to deploy strategic weakness. You have to deploy playing dumb, I guess you could say. And intelligence is by far the most important thing to cultivate in human life, because it just changes the way you perceive everything on a day-to-day basis, including failure. And failure doesn't really feel like failure in that situation. It just feels like a notch in a much larger game. And it's easy to have obvious at leasts when you're intelligent, because you have this screen over any and everything at any given time, where you can point out anything and see its benefit. And it also takes into consideration risk as well. Some things are just completely worth the risk. And it seems different in some people because they don't make catastrophic failure a part of their identity in a strange way. It's almost like this ability to detach from their own doing and pull back from things that have happened to them, because you need to be able to wake up every morning as if it's you're being born in a weird way. It's like you wake up and yes, you carry the momentum of every day that's come before, but in a strange way, it is like being born once again. And you're just a little smarter and a little better, a little more experienced. And it's strange too, because as human beings, as these time binders, we're also completely aware that we're going to die one day. When it comes to life itself, we're ultimately going to technically fail. The one thing that is the most important thing, whether or not somebody lives or dies in any endeavor, is our ultimate destination. And we have this thing inside of us. It's this strange situation where when it comes to death, we're able to like forget about it for a while. It kind of like reoccurs every once in a while, but we're able to forget our own mortality for a bit. I don't think about it, but maybe. I don't know. Not often. And I don't really mind it because I understand it just as much as I understand failure as completely essential, so is death. And I suppose a natural death isn't a failure unless some situation comes around in the future where we're able to augment ourselves and, I guess, live forever. I guess in that sense you could consider all human life before that who didn't figure that thing out as a sort of failure. But that's kind of getting a little bit too broad, I would say. Because, yeah, imagine being able to say, at least I live forever. It's a bit much. Imagine being able to say, at least I never lose. Also a bit much. That's part of the scheme of human life. It's part of us being nerfed, basically, as entities. We can't have a situation ever. It's almost like it's not permitted. We can never have a situation where a human being has a 100% success rate. It's simply never going to happen, in the same way that there are no perfectly straight lines. But we also can't have a 100% failure rate either. If a person had a truly 100% failure rate, hypothetically, let's say a person, no matter what they did, no matter what they said, no matter who they interacted with, every single time they wanted to do something, it didn't go their way, ever. After a certain period of time, and you notice around you other people do get what they want, fairly often at that, it would only be a matter of time until that person started to think that there was some sort of special magic or special spooky, potentially spiritual situation. Maybe God's against them or the universe is against them. That person would start to think that there is some special thing working against them that is almost supernatural. And it would only be a matter of time before that person started to say, well, if everything that I want goes the opposite way, then I will just start not wanting the things that I want. Which adds this strange level of redundancy. It's almost like an inefficiency. It's almost like a complete waste of energy and effort to have that extra step. So it's not possible for a human being to always fail. And like I said, it's also not possible for a human being to always win, because that would, by its very nature, imply certain things about human beings that simply aren't true. If you always won, that would mean that you were aware of all information at all times. You were aware of all intents. You were aware of all the position and makeup of all things. And we obviously don't have that information, at least not handy. So those two are not possible. And it ends up somewhere in the middle, some kind of ratio, based off of the particular circumstances of the individuals involved, based off of their specific makeup, based off the very specific makeup of the situation that they're in, and of every single characteristic of even the planet at the time, the solar system at the time, the weather of everything. And it ends up being a highly, highly nuanced interplay of ratios. Plus, ultimately, the very will of the person involved. And it's hard to say. I mean, at least in my life, it's I would say I definitely win more than I lose, in general. And I'm quite sure that there are people who lose more than they win. And I wonder what that would be like, you know. And I also wonder what the lowest success rate is that's currently out there. And I also know based off of historical accounts, that in the past, success rates have been much lower. Because, let's say your domain was hunting, and it's, 10,000 years ago. I know for sure, or at least I um, strongly think or theorize that the people of that time had a much lower success rate in hunting deer, let's say. I know that there was more attempts made on the life of deer, and I know that more often than not it was a failure. And I also know that today, if a person was really dead set on using all available means to make them to increase their likelihood of killing a deer as much as possible and set out to wipe out an entire forest, they could. So I know that over time the accumulation of information and passing that information down and tethering that information into actual creations and inventions so that the information is actually stored in the things that we make, like a gun, a rifle. The information of our ancestors is stored in that thing. All of the developments of human history, including gunpowder, is stored in that little machine. And it obviously increases success rates. The likelihood of becoming airborne for more than 5 seconds in a situation that didn't involve falling, like off a cliff or something, was basically zero some time ago. But now the odds are much, much higher. The odds of leaving the atmosphere some time ago were much, much lower, but still possible. But now the odds are much, much higher. Over time, the ratio slowly starts to change, and it moves in conjunction with what the actual body of the human civilization is aiming toward. Because there are things that we absolutely could do, but we won't do, because to us, the number one thing is preserving human life and extending it and making it as convenient as we can while still dealing with as much, let's say, adversarial situations as possible, while minimizing the danger, while still not becoming too soft at the same time. You see, there's like this kind of balancing situation that ends up being a ratio. It's like we want things to be difficult, but not too difficult. We want them to be easy, but not too easy. We want to be able to completely blow out the other team, but at the same time, if we're the best, we like to compete against the best. It comes out in a wash like that. And what if you have a very high success rate in general? Like, what if you've already proven that to yourself at a young age? What if generally, let's say 98.8% of the people that you meet, that you come across, are pleasant? What if they're not only pleasant, but they seem to want more of you? And you find yourself in a situation where you have to delegate yourself because you can't spend time with everybody. And you slowly find people that you like, who you prefer to spend your time with. And what if that's already obvious to you? You grow into your 20s, and the world seems to generally want you. Let's put it that way. And then you have the opposite. Those are two totally different experiences. And it's not always so clear why that is, although in some ways it's pretty obvious. And it does have to do with how we expand into other people, whether or not we're actually pleasant ourselves. Because despite what people say, overall, being a pleasant human being is going to bring back to you the pleasantness in other human beings. I've met people who I was told were all sorts of things, and when I met them, they were none of those things. I've met people who were supposed to be terrible, who were actually, not. And over time, I started to see how it is true that you get what you give, but not always. And if most people are generally pleasant to you, then those who aren't don't really seem like a rule. They seem more like a fluke, and it's easy to sort of notice that as maybe they're having a bad day or something like that. It's easy to sort of say something that isn't defining about you, rather about them. But if most people are not pleasant towards you, it's easier to define that as more something based off of you. And that's not comfortable, so that can transition into something about them. It seems like when we normally have a positive, let's say, relationship with the world, you sort of start to forget about certain things. You sort of start to classify things in a different way. And it's definitely a wholly different experience to win all the time, obviously, than it is to fail all the time. But ultimately, no matter what your situation or condition, and even if it's seemingly pretty perilous, even if it seems like overall you're losing quite a bit, you need to be able to pinpoint exactly where all of this is coming from. Like if you start out in a clear and obvious terrible situation, and much of it isn't your doing, and you're just kind of there, and this is your lot, it's a little easier to put this dividing line between that and where you're trying to go, if anywhere. But it's also easy to stay in that wormhole and continue down that line, getting similar things out of the world and bringing similar things into the world. And there's something to be said about somebody who can shed failure off as if it's nothing. But there's also something to be said about the person who loses and takes it pretty hard. Especially when your entire life has been leading up to something, this giant moment, let's say, this thing that has a lot of tethers to it. And in those situations, it takes time to recover, because that shit hurts. Especially when it means a lot and it's important. And it's important to be able to, really, it's so important. It's absolutely critical to be able to see all of the tethers tied to each given event, all of the peripheral variables that hover around each thing, because there are so many things relating to each thing. You really do have a chance to bring more favorable things to you the more that you can see and recognize and influence. And it doesn't have to be a dark, manipulative thing. Quite the opposite. And we all of us, like I said, fail many, 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 many times. And that's part of the whole, I guess, charm of human beings, is the fact that we can be absolutely shattered and lose catastrophically and still shed that off and somehow convert that through some strange transmuting into something that is better in the future. And I try to say that in the least hokey way possible. But there are some people that I've known who started out pretty much in the worst case scenario, who were headed in a clearly worst case direction where you were pretty sure they were going to die. And now they are 180 degrees the opposite than they were. And not only that, their personalities are robust and filled out with this additional geography because they had this a terrible experience prior. The way they handle their successes now just has a different weight to it because of where they've been. But it's strange too. There are all these variables tied to each thing, but at the same time, there can just be one main variable that is even lower down the list that ends up being the one that flips you into the green. You know, you're sitting there at 49.9% and you're still in the failure category, but you're so close. It's sometimes that smallest thing that's, 15th down the list that you just happen to notice by happenstance. Like it just flips into your head and you change that one little thing. It's enough to push you to 51.1, which pushes you into the green. And the fact that it is in the green makes it easier to accelerate to 60, 70, 80% and get it higher and higher. Because there's a difference in being behind. There's a difference. And once you get ahead, it's easier to continue to build. Once you understand the game rules, and there are game rules. Once you understand how human beings are just in general. And once you start to see these schemes that are almost universal, that we didn't employ, but they exist nonetheless, it becomes so much easier to not only take the losses, but continue to plow through and get these very, very sweet wins along the way. And you want to be able to look back when you're old and you're sitting there in your rocking chair and be like, yeah, overall, the combined sum, the overall sense I get from life was that, I had it, I got it, Of course you want that. Because how sweet would that be?